Grab your popcorn as we recap a dark story about a mother and child and the monster they meet. The movie opens up in New Orleans during a parade. A man in a purple suit is playing the trumpet in a cheerful way as the crowd celebrates with him. The rest of the band begin to play along as well. Annie Keller is there with her son George and husband, Dr. Joe Keller. George says he wants to walk instead. However, he gets lost in the crowd really quick. Annie begins to panic, but luckily George finds his way to his mom. Later, George is complaining about wanting dessert. He says he isn't sick, so he deserves some dessert. Joe playfully inspects George and asks him to stick his tongue out so he can make sure George isn't sick. Annie caves in and decides they should get dessert. George is on Joe's back while Annie follows behind. Suddenly, Nancy, an old friend, finds Annie in the crowd. Annie asks Joe to wait for her, but Joe is persistent on getting the dessert, so he leaves Annie with Nancy. Nancy and Annie catch up. Nancy comments that Annie is so different from Joe's past relationships. Later, Annie is waiting for Joe and George to come back, but they haven't yet. So she looks for them. She hears a scream in the crowd. Then, George is seen running in the crowd, so Annie goes to him. But George is crying. She hugs her son to comfort him. Later, she takes George to the infirmary tent to tend to his hand. Joe suddenly appears as he's panting, saying he's been looking all over the place for George. He wonders if George told Annie what had happened. Joe looks worried as he squeezes George in relief. The nurse wonders if Joe is the dad, but Annie clears things up by saying Joe is George's stepdad. Joe says George needed to go to the bathroom, then just ran off. Joe was really scared he had lost his stepson. Annie says George hasn't said a word, so she tells George to let them know what happened. George says some monster was chasing him. Joe looks at Annie and wonders what the monster looked like. George says it had black eyes and it tried to eat him. Joe tends to his hand to make sure his wrist is okay. Once George is in the car, Annie looks at the dying parade crowd with worry. She is upset with Joe since George has a sprained wrist. Annie says she has never seen George so shook in her life. Joe assures her everything will be fine. As they drive away, the man in the purple suit begins to play a more somber jazz song. His eyes are shown and it's pure black. 14 years later, Annie is super paranoid as she looks out her window with a baseball bat. It's her husband Joe coming home from work. Annie tells Joe that she heard noises out back. She warns him that someone is out there. Joe holds the bat in preparation for an intruder, but it's just a surprise party for him. George had just received a medical award for research. Nancy is there and she comments how Annie used to be so poor before. Annie didn't own a nice car or designer clothing. Annie is a little put off by this conversation. But she tells her life story. When Annie was just 15 years old, her father was a drunk and threw Annie's mom into a sliding door. Annie excuses herself quickly to get away from the awkward conversation. Then, George, all grown up now, has finally come home from college. Meanwhile, one of Joe's young patients makes a speech how she received a new heart thanks to Joe. She says Joe has done a lot for many children just like her. Then, a strange young man takes the mic. Apparently, his sister was a patient of Joe's. Her name was Julie White, but Joe says he can't remember her. Annie interrupts the awkward situation by signaling guys to take the strange young man away. Joe turns to George and says that is why you don't do drugs. Suddenly, the strange young man comes back and punches Joe right in the face. Joe excuses himself to tend to his eye. As the party is dying down, George is rushing to leave already. He'll be staying at a friend's house. Joe goes to give George a hug, but George flinches away and pats Joe instead. Later that night, Annie wants to know more about Julie White. Joe says she was a resident at the hospital 13 or 14 years ago. Julie had fallen in love with Joe, and Joe says they fired her to keep things clean. Joe admits to having an affair with Julie, and surprisingly Annie isn't super upset about it. She just wished that Joe had told her a long time ago. Joe admits he didn't want to bother Annie about it at the time because George was having nightmares. George thought the house was haunted and Annie was close to losing her marbles. Annie decides to change the subject, then walks away. In the middle of the night, Annie starts to hear jazz music coming from the street. She sees the man with the purple suit, so she closes the window. The next morning, Annie is trying to get a hold of George, but he isn't picking up. Then Nancy tells her to turn on the news. Annie goes downstairs and finds Joe speaking to HR from the hospital. The woman tells them Julie White had uploaded a video on her Twitter account accusing Joe of sexual misconduct. And several other women have come forward. Julie White is just 19 years old and actually an old patient of Joe's, not a doctor. There was one accusation from an 11-year-old girl as well. This shocks Annie. However, she is more furious that Joe's award was just revoked without proof. Annie is upset and says that these girls just want money. She wonders how men are supposed to move through life with everyone just accepting the girl's accusations. Joe cries and admits to Annie that he needs help, basically admitting to the accusations. Annie is upset because they were children. Joe sobs into his hands. News reporters have parked in front of her house at this point. It is said that more than 40 female patients have come forward with the same accusation. Annie watches the television while Julie says she was just 8 years old when Dr. Joe had taken advantage of her. Later, Nancy finally calls Annie to check up on her. And Annie frantically asks her 21 questions about Joe if Nancy had an inkling of this going on. She brings up what Nancy had said to her at the parade about Annie being different than all the girls Joe had dated. Annie then looks at photos of the day at the New Orleans parade. She doesn't understand how she could have missed this detail of Joe. By this time, Annie hasn't been able to reach George yet. She ends up laying in bed depressed about the situation as the sounds of jazz linger in her mind. Later that night, she wakes up to the same jazz music that has been plaguing her. She goes to lock her front door, then all of a sudden a rock is thrown into their house. The rock says the R word. Then, Annie notices the man with the purple suit playing jazz. She goes to him and wonders if he was the one that threw the rock. The man emerges from the darkness to reveal his black eyes and sharp teeth. She tries to run away, but the man grabs her, so Annie hits him until he's unconscious. She drags his body away to hide in a storage unit. While Annie is cleaning up the mess, all she hears in her head is Julie White's testimony about how Joe took advantage of her. Annie then leaves George a voicemail saying she's done something terrible. Later, Annie looks at the storage unit's door from the window, and she notices it moving. She grabs an ice pick from the drawer to protect herself as she moves closer to the door. Suddenly, the man with the suit is behind her and bites her. She screams in pain, then stabs the man with the ice pick. She rushes back into the house. Then all of a sudden the loud trumpet noises break through her window. Then it opens her door. Annie runs throughout the house to get away from the noise. She makes her way to the basement and notices the basement door is swinging. When finally someone approaches her. Luckily, it's just her son George. She is relieved and hugs him. Later, Annie tells George that some monster was over at the house last night breaking the windows. She brings up the monster that George had come across at the parade. Annie reminds George about all the nightmares he used to get because of the monster. She apologizes for never believing in him about the monster because the weight it was too big for her back then. But now she believes in it. George is really confused as Annie refers to the monster. He wonders if Annie is on drugs. George commands his mom to sit down so they can talk about what happened at the parade. Before he begins, George wonders if his mom has anything to admit to. However, she denies knowing anything. George finally admits that Joe had touched him at the parade just like how he touched those little girls. He wants to talk about it. However, Annie asks him about the monster instead. George says the monster wasn't real, the real monster was Joe. And Annie never wanted to believe the truth. Annie yells at him because she doesn't want to hear the truth. George chases after her to walk through the events of the parade again. George tells her that Joe had taken him to a stall. Annie signals him to stop and says that never happened. In fact, George had told his mom what had happened when he finally found his mom. Annie just pretended to have never heard it. She admits that she refused to believe it because she was on minimum wage, flipping couch cushions for change. Joe was their quickest way to get rich. George has everything. Even a great education at UCLA. George admits that he's failing every class because of his childhood trauma. George wants Annie to admit that she's known all along. Annie denies knowing anything. And she doesn't remember. She tries to walk away from the conversation, but George goes to her asking if she's ashamed. He reminds her that Joe had touched many young girls. Then, George says this is why Joe married her. Annie was just a low-class maid. She was a desperate single mom looking for a handout. And Joe knew Annie would keep her mouth shut. He paid her off with this big house. George admits that he's still that scared child, always praying that his stepdad didn't show up in the middle of the night. Annie then has flashbacks of that day in the parade. George had whispered to his mother what had happened in the stall. She stands a little shocked at the revelation that she might have just suppressed. George gives his mom one last time to admit to knowing all along. However, she does not, so George walks away. Annie runs after him outside, but the sound of the trumpets blast her back into the house. She crawls to the floor. The noise of the trumpets are so deafening that Annie goes crazy to find some quiet. She grabs the ice pick on the floor and grabs it to puncture her ear. She punctures both ears so she won't hear the trumpet sounds anymore. Everything is quiet and Annie feels relief. Unfortunately, the silence doesn't last long as the sound of jazz plays behind her. She cries in despair. Then she turns around to face the man. She ends up following the trumpet player to the cemetery, then finally to the city. She stares at the man with the dark eyes. Then the entire band is there with dark eyes as well. They all walk toward Annie to gather around her. There's a lot of little things to notice in this piece. Like when Annie refuses to hear more on Joe's lies about Julie White being a doctor, she was complacent. Also, when Annie signaled men to take Julie White's brother away, Annie probably already knew at the time what the brother was going to say. She wanted to protect her husband's image. Nicole Beharie's performance as the mother was top-notch. I hated her, but I felt every emotion through the screen. Every time she would hear the jazz music, it was a constant reminder of what her son had whispered to her. Something that she refused to listen to. In the last scene where she poked her ears with an ice pick, she wanted so badly to not hear the truth. However, even when she lost her hearing, she had to face the music. She had to face the consequences to not listening to her son.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.